colonies. It persuaded entire families to escape to British lines, many of which were employed on farms to grow food for the army by removing the requirement for military service. While Clinton organized the Black Pioneers, he also ensured fugitive slaves were returned to Loyalist owners with orders that they were not to be punished for their attempted escape. 366. As the war progressed, service as regular soldiers in British units became increasingly common. Black Loyalists formed tour regiments of the Charleston garrison in 1783. 367. Estimates of the numbers who served the British during the war vary from 25,000 to 50,000, excluding those who escaped during wartime. Thomas Jefferson estimated that Virginia may have lost 30,000 Slavs and total escapes. 368. In South Carolina, nearly 25,000 slaves, about 30% of the enslaved population, either fled, migrated, or died, which significantly disrupted the plantation economies both during and after the war. 369. Black patriots were barred from the Continental Army until Washington convinced Congress in January 1778 that there was no other way to replace losses from disease and desertion. The 1st Rhode Island Regiment, formed in February, included former slaves whose owners were compensated. However, only 140 of its 225 soldiers were black, and recruitment stopped in June 1788. 370. Ultimately, around 5,000 African Americans served in the Continental Army and Navy in a variety of roles, while another 4,000 were employed in Patriot militia units, aboard privateers, or as teamsters, servants, and spies. After the war, a copy of Smock issued to black loyalists in 1776. Small minority received land grants or congressional pensions in old age. Many others were returned to their masters post-war despite earlier promises of freedom. 371. A scene of 4 uniformed soldiers of the Continental 1st Rhode Island Regiment. On the left, a black and a white soldier formally at attention with brown Bess muskets. On the right, a downcast white soldier walking back into formation with an officer barking at him holding a cat-o'-nine tails for flogging. Continental soldiers, one from the 1st Rhode Island Regiment, left as a Patriot victory became increasingly likely. The treatment of black loyalists became a point of contention. After the surrender of Yorktown in 1781, Washington insisted all escapees be returned, but Cornwallis refused. In 1782 and 1783, around 8,000 to 10,000 freed blacks were evacuated by the British from Charleston, Savannah, and New York. Some moved on to London, while 3,000 to 4,000 settled in Nova Scotia, where they founded settlements such as Burtown. 372. White loyalists transported 15,000 enslaved blacks to Jamaica and the Bahamas. The free black loyalists who migrated to the British West Indies included regular soldiers from Dumura's Ethiopian Regiment, and those from Charleston who helped garrison the Leeward Islands. 367. Native Americans. Most Native Americans east of the Mississippi River were affected by the war, and many tribes were divided over how to respond to the conflict. A few tribes were friendly with the colonists, but most natives opposed the union of the colonies as a potential threat to their territory. Approximately 13,000 natives fought on the British side, with the largest group coming from the Iroquois tribes who deployed around 1,500 men. 31. Portrait of British Regular Army Colonel Joseph Brant, Iroquois Mohawk. Colonel Joseph Brant, GB, led Iroquois Mohawk in war early in July 1776, Cherokee allies of Britain attacked the short-lived Washington District of North Carolina. Their defeat splintered both Cherokee settlements and people, and was directly responsible for the rise of the Chickamauga Cherokee, who perpetuated the Cherokee-American wars against American settlers for decades after hostilities with Britain ended. 373. Creek and Seminole allies of Britain fought against Americans in Georgia and South Carolina. In 1778, a force of 800 Creeks destroyed American settlements along the Broad River in Georgia. Creek warriors also joined Thomas Brown's raids into South Carolina and assisted Britain during the siege of Savannah. 374. Many Native Americans were involved in the fight between Britain and Spain on the Gulf Coast and along the British side of the Mississippi River. Thousands of Creeks, Chickasaws, and Choctaws fought in major battles such as the Battle of Fort Charlotte, the Battle of Mobile, and the Siege of Pensacola. 375. The Iroquois Confederacy was shattered as a result of the American Revolutionary War, whatever side they took. The Seneca Onondaga and Cayuga tribes sided with the British, members of the Mohawks fought on both sides, and many Tuscarora and Oneida sided with the Americans. To retaliate against raids on American settlement by Portrait of U.S. Regular Army Colonel Joseph Cook, Iroquois Mohawk. Colonel Joseph Cook, U.S. Iroquois Oneida in war loyalists and their Indian allies. The Continental Army dispatched a Sullivan expedition on a punitive expedition throughout New York to debilitate the Iroquois tribes that had sided with the British. Mohawk leaders Joseph Louis Cook and Joseph Brant sided with Americans and the British respectively, which further exacerbated the split. 376. In the Western theater of the American Revolutionary War, conflicts between settlers and Native Americans led to lingering distrust. 377. In the 1783 Treaty of Paris, Great Britain ceded control of the disputed lands between the Great Lakes and the Ohio River, but Indian inhabitants were not a part of the peace negotiations. 378. Tribes in the Northwest Territory joined as the Western Confederacy and allied with the British to resist American settlement, and their conflict continued after the Revolutionary War as the Northwest Indian War. 379. Britain's American War and Peace. Changing Prime Ministers. Lord North, Prime Minister since 1770, delegated control of the war in North America to Lord George Germain and the Earl of Sandwich, who was head of the Royal Navy from 1771 to 1782. Defeat at Saratoga in 1777 made it clear the revolt would not be easily suppressed, especially after the Franco-American alliance of February 1778, and French declaration of war in June. With Spain also expected to join the conflict, the Royal Navy needed to prioritize either the war in America or in Europe. Germain advocated the former, Sandwich the latter. 380. British negotiators now proposed a second peace settlement to Congress. 381. The terms presented by the Carlisle Peace Commission included acceptance of the principle of self-government. Parliament will recognize Congress as the governing body, suspend any objectionable legislation, surrender its right to local colonial taxation, and discuss including American representatives in the House of Commons. In return, all property confiscated from loyalists would be returned, British debts honored, and locally enforced martial law accepted. However, Congress demanded either immediate recognition of independence or the withdrawal of all British troops. They knew the Commission were not authorized to accept these, bringing negotiations to a rapid end. 382. When the Commissioners returned to London in November 1778, they recommended a change in policy. Sir Henry Clinton, the new British Commander-in-Chief in America, was ordered to stop treating the rebels as enemies, rather than subjects whose loyalty might be regained. 383. Those standing orders would be in effect for 3 years until Clinton was relieved. 384. North initially backed the Southern strategy attempting to exploit divisions between the mercantile North and slave-owning South. But after the defeat of Yorktown, he was forced to accept the fact that this policy had failed. 385. It was clear the war was lost, although the Royal Navy forced the French to relocate their fleet to the Caribbean in November 1781 and resumed a close blockade of American trade. 386. The resulting economic damage and rising inflation meant the US was now eager to end the war, while France was unable to provide further loans. Congress could no longer pay its soldiers. 387. On the 27th of February, 1782, a Whig motion to end the offensive war in America was carried by 19 votes. 388. North now resigned, obliging the king to invite Lord Rockingham to form a government. A consistent supporter of the Patriot cause, he made a commitment to U.S. independence a condition of doing so. George III reluctantly accepted and the new government took office on the 27th of March, 1782. However, Rockingham died unexpectedly on July 1st, and was replaced by Lord Shelburne, who acknowledged American independence. 389. American Congress signs a peace. Portrait of the 4 principal U.S. ministers in Paris, left to right: John Jay, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Henry Laurens, and their secretary on the far right. Treaty of Paris by Benjamin West portrays the American mission of left-right: John Jay, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, William Temple Franklin, secretary, in red, and Henry Laurens, when Lord Rockingham, the Whig leader and friend of the American cause, was elevated to Prime Minister, Congress consolidated its diplomatic consuls in Europe into a peace legation at Paris. All were experienced in congressional leadership. The dean of the delegation was Benjamin Franklin of Pennsylvania. He had become a celebrity in the French court, but was also an Enlightenment scientist with influence in the courts of European great powers in Prussia, England's former ally, and Austria, a Catholic empire like Spain. Since the 1760s he had been an organizer of British-American intercolony cooperation, and then a colonial lobbyist to Parliament in London. John Adams of Massachusetts had been consul to the Dutch Republic and was a prominent early New England patriot. John Jay of New York had been consul to Spain and was a past president of the Continental Congress. As consul to the Dutch Republic, Henry Laurens of South Carolina had secured a preliminary agreement for a treaty agreement. He had been a successor to John Jay as President of Congress and with Franklin was a member of the American Philosophical Society. Although active in the preliminaries, he was not a signer of the conclusive treaty. 266. The Whig negotiators for Lord Rockingham and his successor, Prime Minister Lord Shelburne, included longtime friend of Benjamin Franklin from his time in London, David Hartley and Richard Oswald, who had negotiated Laurens' release from the Tower of London. 266. The preliminary peace signed on November 30 met 4 key congressional demands: independence, territory up to the Mississippi, navigation rights into the Gulf of Mexico, and fishing rights in Newfoundland. 266. British strategy was to strengthen the U.S. sufficiently to prevent France from regaining a foothold in North America, and they had little interest in these proposals. 391. However, divisions between their opponents allowed them to negotiate separately with each to improve their overall position, starting with the American delegation in September 1782. 392. the French and Spanish sought to improve their position by creating the U.S. dependent on them for support against Britain, thus reversing the losses of 1763.393. Both parties tried to negotiate a settlement with Britain excluding the Americans. France proposed setting the western boundary of the U.S. along the Appalachians, matching the British 1763 proclamation line. The Spanish requested additional concessions in the vital Mississippi River basin, but required the cession of Georgia in violation of the Franco-American Alliance. 393, facing difficulties with Spain over claims involving the Mississippi River, and from France, who was still reluctant to agree to American independence until all her demands were met. John Jay promptly told the British that he was willing to negotiate directly with them, cutting off France and Spain, and Prime Minister Lord Shelburne, in charge of the British negotiations, agreed. 394. Key agreements for America in obtaining peace included recognition of United States independence, that she would gain all of the area east of the Mississippi River, north of Florida, and south of Canada, the granting of fishing rights in the Grand military governors and staff officers in British North America and West Indies 1778 and 1784 banks, off the coast of Newfoundland and in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. The United States and Great Britain were to each be given perpetual access to the Mississippi River. 395. 396. An Anglo-American preliminary peace was formally entered into on November 1782, and Congress endorsed the settlement on April 15, 1783. It announced the achievement of peace with independence. The conclusive treaty was signed on September 2, 1783, in Paris, effective the next day, September 3, when Britain signed its treaty with France. John Adams, who helped draft their treaty, claimed it represented one of the most important political events that ever happened on the globe. Ratified respectively by Congress and Parliament, the final versions were exchanged in Paris the following spring. 397, on the 25th of November, the last British troops remaining in the U.S. were evacuated from New York to Halifax. 398, aftermath. A New York City street scene with a mounted George Washington riding at the head of a parade. Washington enters New York City at British evacuation, November 1783, and Washington expressed astonishment that the Americans had won a war against a leading world power, referring to the American victory as little short of a standing miracle. 399. The conflict between British subjects with the Crown against those with the Congress had lasted over 8 years, from 1775 to 1783. The last uniformed British troops departed their last East Coast port cities in Savannah, Charleston, and New York City, by the 25th of November, 1783. That marked the end of British occupation in the new United States. 400. On the 9th of April, 1783, Washington issued orders that he had long waited to give, that all acts of hostility were to cease immediately. That same day, by arrangement with Washington, General Carleton issued a similar order to British troops. British troops, however, were not to evacuate until a prisoner of war exchange occurred, an effort that involved much negotiation and would take some 7 months to effect. 401, as directed by a congressional resolution of the 26th of May, 1783, all non-commissioned officers and enlisted were furloughed to their homes until the definitive treaty of peace, when they would be automatically discharged. The U.S. armies were directly disbanded in the field as of Washington's general orders on Monday, June 2, 1783.402. Once the conclusive Treaty of Paris was signed with Britain, Washington resigned as Commander-in-Chief at Congress, leaving for his army retirement at